This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, we're already a few weeks into 2020, and this year has been
racing by.
It has been racing by. We're glad to have you all listening in again with us.
Yes.
And again, my name is Sam, and I'm your host. This is the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, and I get to sit across from Richard Blackaby today.
Welcome, one and all.
Absolutely. So we're doing something that we haven't done in a while. We try and do these, I think I say this every time, but we try and do these every month, but it just doesn't always work out that way. And it's one of my favorite segments, and many of our listeners, their favorites as well. And it is the leadership book review.
Yeah.
And,
it's not that we haven't been reading leadership books, but we had some Christmas and New Year's special podcasts, and just took a few weeks extra to get back to it.
Right. It's that time of year where it seems relaxing as it may be, it oftentimes gets filled up with other stuff, and so we just put this one off until now. And maybe tell us what book it is we're looking at.
Yeah, and I think Sam, one of the reasons we do this is because we just want to encourage our listeners to always have some kind of leadership book that they're reading. Pretty well all the time. I usually have a biography on the go, and I usually have a leadership book on the go, and then whatever else devotionally or professionally that I might be reading as well. And so I've got actually a stack of leadership books I've read that we'll be previewing here as we get them in the queue. So, but this one today is called Ego is the Enemy, and it's by Ryan Holiday. And Ryan has written several books. And Sam, I think you said have you listened to some of his podcasts, whatever?
I've seen him on podcasts. I think he has his own YouTube channel. I think it's called The Daily Stoic, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and this is kind of an interesting book for me. Some folks, I'm sure some of our listeners know Cheryl Batchelder. She's a very, very sharp woman who was a very successful CEO of Popeyes for a number of years. Was award-winning and has just had a very extensive, successful CEO career. But I work with Cheryl and a particular project that we do together. And one of the last times I was with her, she mentioned this book. Whenever you get around a really smart, successful person, it's always wise to ask, what are you reading?
And for sure.
She liked this book enough that she'd bought and purchased, I think, a box of them and was kind of giving them out to friends and colleagues and so on. And so that was enough for me to want to read the book. And so I did. There are certain people that when they say you ought to read this book, I just go to Amazon and order it right then.
Right.
And in fact, but I think she gave this one to me. So then I really wanted to read it. And so it's an interesting take on ego. And I don't know how many of us as readers think, oh boy, I haven't read a book on ego lately. I need to do that. And yet, certainly in our culture and in just the kind of challenges and environment that leaders live and work, it's certainly an important issue that I think it's good to circle around and kind of take our own spiritual pulse to make sure that we've got this issue under control.
And the ego can crop up in all sorts of ways. It can manifest. It's not always just the guy out there tooting his own horn, but as we'll see, it can manifest in many different ways. And maybe before we get into that, why don't you just tell us how he defines ego in the book?
Yeah, he doesn't define it in a positive way. He says ego is an unhealthy belief in our own importance, arrogance, self-centered ambition. And he talks about the fact that there are 4 stages to ego. He talks about aspiration, and then success, and then failure, and then back again. And he says we're all in one of those stages. We're either aspiring to achieve something, or we're experiencing success in that field. We've actually achieved what we were pursuing. And then inevitably at some point we're going to experience some failure. And then he says we're back at it again. We're aspiring once again. And so that's kind of his schema of how he lays out the journey that can lead to ego. He says there's no one moment that changes a person. There are many. To go from wanting to be like someone your whole life to realizing you never want to be like him is a kind of whiplash that you can't prepare for. And that's kind of his story. He was in marketing field and working for a company and for a person he greatly admired. And then through just a series of difficult circumstances, he watched a leader that he admired really captivated by ego. And he watched the devastation that comes when you let ego blind you to truth and facts and reality. He says that ego inhibits true success by preventing a direct and honest connection to the world around us. He says ego makes us not see reality properly in ourselves, in our companies, in the problems we're facing. It tends to make us want to blame others for our shortcomings and so on. It causes us to overestimate our contributions. And what I liked about this particular book is that he begins, and he kind of at the very start lays out a bit of a biographical journey, just telling you about his own journey and how he was disillusioned by what ego could do to someone he greatly admired. But then at a certain point, he kind of stops and says, but I'm not going to make this whole book about my personal journey. And of course, so many books are that way. Someone has a traumatic experience or a successful experience, or they start a company or do something good or bad, and then the whole book basically goes through a process of what they learned and experienced through that time in their life. And he says, no, I want to go in a sense deeper than that, and I want to survey the wisdom literature from people throughout history and see what they have to say about it. And of course, for me, that's way more appealing.
I was gonna say, I think you got hooked once you start talking about.
I'd never heard of Ryan Holiday before I read this book, and so his own journey might be very interesting and instructive. But at a certain point, it's like, well, that's your journey, and that was your struggle, and maybe your weakness. But when he starts pulling in wisdom literature from all kinds of sources, politics, military, philosophy, particularly I was struck by his, he has a fondness for the Stoics. Yeah. And he talks about Seneca, for one, and Marcus Aurelius and others. And in fact, he got me kind of hooked on it. I remember after reading this book, I realized I'd never read anything by Seneca. And Seneca, I believe, was George Washington's favorite author. He read Seneca all the time and tried to base his life on the Stoic philosophy espoused there. And so actually, I bought one of Seneca's primary writings and have been reading it. We'll probably profile that coming up. The Stoics, there's a lot that Stoics have to offer, I think, particularly in our society and certainly to leaders. And so that's one thing I really like about this book, is that he draws upon professional sporting coaches and world leaders and military generals and so on, good and bad.
Well, I think you really see that he's a student of this. Yeah. And he's not just he's not just doling out advice from his experience, but he has really studied a lot of these major figures throughout history.
Yeah, and I love history, and I love getting your life around the experiences of people in the past and what you're learning from their mistakes, so you don't have to make them yourself. And really, what I might do is just kind of scroll through here and just he basically is unpacking ego and kind of what it can do and how it can blind you and some ways to protect yourself from it. But what I might do is just kind of give you a glimpse of some of the quotes that stood out to me.
Sure.
Whether at home, on the job, or in the ministry, we can all have a greater impact on the world around us for the kingdom of God. Join Richard Blackaby at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove to learn about increasing your spiritual influence on April 6th through the 8th, 2020. Space is limited, so register soon at the link in the show notes. If you like what we're doing and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Even a little bit will go a long way toward keeping this podcast going for the months and years to come. To support this podcast, click on the link in the show notes. We are truly grateful for our wonderful community of listeners.
He does say, of course, he'll tell you that ego is blinds you to reality. It's going to cripple you. It's going to inevitably lead you to failure. But then it's interesting, he does mention what he calls outliers, which are some people that were notoriously egotistical and seemed to be successful anyway.
Yeah,
I
a
think
few come to mind.
He feels that he kind of has to address that because some come to mind. And for instance, he mentioned someone like Steve Jobs, that, was not known as a humble person, or, he very opinionated and often just believed it had to be his way. And so, and yet he built one of the most successful companies in history. And so I think you could probably look at the founder of Amazon and some other companies and say, well, Bezos and Jobs aren't necessarily known as wallflower, humble, people, always deferring to other people's opinions. And so there's a certain amount of myth around people like that says, well, if you're going to be fabulously successful, you've got to just be very assertive and outspoken and confident. You've got to grab hold of your vision and not worry about what other people say or think. And he would just tend to say, well, some of these people, you would never say they were successful because they were prideful. You'd never say their ego is what gave them their success. It was their ego might have helped them persevere because they were so confident. They persevered in adversity, but if you really unpack their success, it's not. It was almost despite their ego, not because of their ego. And so, Jobs, at times, his pride could offend his primary partner in Wozniak, but it sometimes almost cost him his friendship with his partners. But really, what his success was that he had some really gifted people working with him, and he had an ability to draw those people in. So he does start with that. But then he just gives a number of examples, and what was I thought also interesting is that some of the people he kind of looks to as examples we might look at as a negative one. One thing, perhaps a critique of this, was some of the people that he highlights. You might say it's interesting that you chose that person. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that as we go. But he says, one might say that the ability to evaluate one's own ability is the most important skill of all. To see yourself as you really are. He quotes a famous quote by Winston Churchill: "Facts are better than dreams." The people that are very successful are the people that look at reality and see it clearly, and the reality of themselves and their abilities, their shortcomings, their problems. And he has an interesting discussion about talking. He says some people talk a lot, and he says you're not learning when you're talking, and you're not necessarily accomplishing anything when you're talking. He says the only relationship between work and chatter is that one kills the other. Either you're working so you don't have time to chatter, or you're chattering so you don't have time to work. There's just a number of course. I just love when he surveys famous people and some of the things they had to say. He mentions Frederick Douglass, who said, "A man is worked upon by what he works on." And I thought that was interesting. Whatever it is you work on, that's going to be working on you. He says, the pretense of knowledge is our most dangerous vice. He quotes Epictetus, who says, "You can't learn if you think you already know." And there's he says there's an old saying that says, when a student is ready, the teacher appears. Some of those statements you have to kind of think about, but what he's saying is, if you're not in a teachable moment, you're probably not going to have anyone coming around trying to offer you advice or counsel. But when you are ready to learn, there's usually some source of learning available to you, but you just weren't accessing it earlier because you didn't think you needed to learn. And he gives some interesting examples. He mentions, for instance, the invention of the Segway, that mobile device you stand on, you see in airports and things. And,
you see group tours with going through downtown areas.
He'll talk about it's kind of an interesting little study he does, where when that first came out, it was considered brilliant, and people like Steve Jobs and others said, like, this is the biggest thing since laptops, kind of thing. And then he says what's kind of interesting about that study is he says there were a lot of people that felt like this was like the surest thing to make people rich and be successful that they come across in a long time. But then it didn't. It never met those expectations. And he says, how can someone as brilliant as Steve Jobs have been so wrong on that one? And so it's kind of an interesting study. He says, just because you've been successful at some things doesn't mean that you're smart about everything.
Yeah.
And
well, it's interesting because we had that same study, and I think it was the last book review we did, Originals.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, they talked about that same issue, was that, all these folks thought that this was the next best thing, but they were all wrong about it.
Yeah. And people, and there's a certain ego that says, well, if I've been really good at politics or in the military or building cars, then I'm just a brilliant guy, and whatever I think and see as having potential or promise, then I'm just good at that in every area. And he would say there's success sometimes can lead to some of our worst failures because we lose sight of reality. We're not seeing it clearly anymore. Interestingly, he looks at one of the examples. He says several things. For instance, he says passion typically masks weakness. We tend to value passion, and if you're really passionate about something, then you're going to probably be more successful. And we tend to think of the people that pioneered new companies and inventions as people that had this bold vision, and they passionately pursued it, despite all the obstacles. But he would say sometimes that's not passion. Sometimes causes you not to see reality clearly. In fact, sometimes passion, we've seen this even with sports teams. It might be an average skilled team, but they play with a lot of passion and heart. And that can kind of take you above your skill grade for at least a while. But long term, it's not as effective as just building in the right kind of processes and skill sets. He says some other interesting things. He says, clear a path for the people above you, and you will eventually create a path for yourself. And it's talking about humility. There's some people that never want to be in an associate role. They always want to be in charge. And yet he gives some examples of people that were willing to make other people successful so that in time they had their own opportunity to become successful as well. Mm-hmm. And that's why I always say some of the best leaders have been the best followers. They were the best lieutenants. We looked at that with Eisenhower. For years, he worked under George Marshall and MacArthur.
Which he mentions George Marshall.
Yeah, as an example of someone that was a great, he was a great lieutenant. He was loyal, and he would say, if you want to have success, be good at helping other people have success as well. And if you're in a secondary role, do that well. Don't sit out over in the corner and pout because you're not in charge.
Well, that just makes so much sense, and it just seems sort of like a no-brainer. We even looked at that with the life of Joseph. Mm-hmm. He was making those, above him successful, and ultimately led to his own success.
One of those examples I mentioned, he talks about Bill Belichick, coach of the Patriots football team, and of course now he's kind of maligned as someone who'll do anything to win in some circles at least. But he gives the example of him for years earning his opportunity to become a head coach. For years he served in secondary roles and always went the extra mile. Always tried to make people around him successful. And it's kind of interesting because you don't see him used, although he's got a very successful track record. He's gotten some bad press along the way, but so it's kind of interesting some of the people he chooses to look at. But what's interesting is a lot of the people that are now in their glory and they're on the pedestal now and they're in the limelight. It's always interesting to see how they got there, and oftentimes they didn't just start out there. They were great lieutenants. They were great at going the extra mile, staying later, getting there earlier, paying their dues, so that eventually they got their shot, and then they made the most of it when they got it. There's some interesting little quips. He says, for instance, say little, do much. There's some people that talk a lot and don't do much. And I've had those people. come up to me and want to impress me with all that they thought about certain things. Years ago, I had someone wanting to impress me with all their knowledge about church planting, and they went on and on and on about all that they knew and all they'd studied and articles they'd written. And I finally stopped him and said, "Have you actually planted a church?" And he hadn't. But he wanted to become a professor teaching others how to do something he'd never done himself. He had much to say, but he had done very little. Also, sometimes ego is kept in check when you restrain yourself. And he gives the example of Jackie Robinson, of course, first African-American professional baseball player in the major leagues. And it's a famous story of how people were trying to prod him and agitate him to basically lose control and become angry, and he was just advised at the outset, people are going to come after you. They're going to try to get under your skin, but don't let them do it. Don't let them throw you off your game. And so what made him so successful was he restrained himself. And earlier in his life, he'd had a temper, and he had done some pretty wild things, but to become great meant he had to just control himself, and not, even if it was unjust and it was unfair. And he said, one of the quotes related to that, he said, "When you want to do something big and important and meaningful, you will be subjected to treatment ranging from indifference to outright sabotage. Count on it." He also talks about get out of your own head. He refers to George McClellan, the famous Civil War general under Lincoln, that was an egotist to the max, who saw himself as kind of a modern day Napoleon. But he was always nervous to fight. He always thought if he just had more supplies, more men, more money, then he could do more. And it was not his fault. It was people weren't giving him what he needed, and this gives some great examples of people that their ego basically was their undoing. That a guy like Ulysses Grant was not known as a prideful person, but ultimately was the one who got the job done. And the prideful guy that everybody thought was such a fantastic general finally was just cast aside because his ego just prevented him from leading. Because he says we tend to think that ego equals confidence. And he says, now, confidence is not a bad thing. You need confidence. If you're going to lead, you have to have confidence. Nobody wants to lead an unconfident leader. But ego, he would define it as different. He would say, ego is about you. It's about, it's blindly getting filled up with yourself.
Yeah. Confidence
just says, I see reality, and I know I'm good at this. If you're a outstanding basketball player, it's not. There's no reason not to have. If you don't have confidence, you're not going to take that jump shot at the closing seconds of the game.
Yeah,
you got to have confidence. But there's a difference between that and ego that says, I'm the best guy on this team. I should always be taking that final shot. I should never pass. I should get paid way more than everybody else because I'm the best. This team would crumble without me. That's ego. Confidence just says, I know I can make that shot, and in a clutch moment, I'm going to make it. And then you do. So, and that's, I think, one of the great dangers is we sometimes substitute ego with confidence.
Yeah.
And I think you've got to be careful with that. Last thing just to say on that is he asked some good questions. He says, what am I missing right now that a non-humble person might see? Or a more humble person might see?
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting question. Has my ego somehow blinded me? And now I'm missing a really important factor. My company is struggling, or I'm having conflicts with some of the people on my staff. I'm getting criticized a lot lately, and I don't see it. I don't understand why this is happening. Could it be that my ego is blinding me to some reality that's going on? If I were more humble, would I recognize some things and see the causes instead of thinking it's never my fault? Maybe if I had more humility, I'd realize, well, actually, when I treat people that way, when I talk this way, when I don't hand out affirmation and credit, I keep getting these results. And so if you were more humble, if you were less egotistical, would you see more things that would help you and lead to greater success?
So, Richard, as we wrap up here, what are some of your final thoughts, final looks at ego as the enemy?
Well, let me just give you a couple of quick quotes here that just pop out at me. Henry Ford said, "You can't build a reputation on what you're going to do." Bill Bradley, famous basketball player, said, when you are not practicing, remember someone somewhere is practicing, and when you meet him, he will win. So when you think, I don't need to do it anymore, he takes on the phrase that's quite popular, fake it till you make it. He says, versus make it so you don't have to fake it.
Yeah.
He says, too many people are faking it today, and that ego causes you to do that. He's interesting. He uses Genghis Khan as a model because he says he was the greatest conqueror the world has ever known because he was more open to learning than any other conqueror has ever been. He looks at some people like DeLorean, famous inventor of the car, but says he was a genius. Sadly, that's rarely enough. Just being smart, but becoming so confident. He quotes a soccer coach, Tony Adams, who says, play for the name on the front of the jersey, and they'll remember the name on the back, which I thought was a great quote. Play for the team, and they'll remember who you are. Play for yourself, and then they won't. James Basford said, it requires a strong constitution to withstand repeated attacks of prosperity. I like that quote. And just one or two last ones. Lots of great quotes there. It's one of those things where I think I also bought a biography on, probably 2 or 3, Jackie Robinson. I think I got a biography on him afterward too, just reading a story about him in this book, and brought a book. I can always tell a good book when it costs me to buy about 3 other books because I think, wow, I want to read that too. Maybe two last quotes. Bill Walsh, who was coach for San Francisco 49ers, said almost always your road to victory goes through a place called failure. And Plutarch, the future bears down upon each one of us with all the hazard of the unknown. And maybe just the last quote. Interesting story tells Alexander the Great went to talk to the philosopher Diogenes, and Diogenes was apparently impoverished, had very, very little, was sitting out in the sun. He was a philosopher, and Alexander the Great wanted to come and see if there's anything he could do for him. He's the conqueror of the known world, and powerful and rich and wealthy, and here's this impoverished philosopher. So the philosopher is lying there in the sun. Alexander the Great walks up to him and asks him, what can I do for you? And he said, stop blocking my sun. And I thought it was kind of an interesting story. Here's the guy who thinks he's so great. I can offer you anything, all the gold, diamonds, wealth that you might want. What can I give you? And he said, I'm enjoying the sun right now. You just step out of get out of the shade there, stop shading my view. And I think sometimes we think we're big stuff, and yet we're missing the most important stuff. That's what ego can do. And so I think for every leader, you got to come around, just like taking your pulse, your weight, your heart rate, your blood pressure. There are moments where you got to circle back around to ego to say, has it found a way to creep into my life where I don't have my feet on the ground anymore like I ought to? And it's costing me and it's costing others. So it's a good read. I think it's one you ought to put it on your reading list, and it'll also probably spur you to want to read a bunch of other folks after you have.
Yeah, I found that Holiday has that effect on you, that you start reading some of it, and he brings in all these other books and
makes you want to be better read.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great read, and thanks for taking us through it.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.